Good morning, Anthony. I'm looking forward to discussing facial expressions with you in humans, but also animals. And what led to this topic was some personal experiences. I noticed that Taylor Swift, the famous singer, seems to use her eyes in a very powerful manner. The crowd seems to respond to her just a slight change in her facial expressions, particularly with regards to eye glancing. And I found that fascinating. It seemed like she had some sort of power over the crowd. They respond to her eye movements. At least that was my impression, having attended a concert recently in Cardiff. The other personal experience was that I noticed that Carlos Alcaraz, the Wimbledon champion, over the weekend, in particularly heated competitive moments, he would snarl in a somewhat strange way. His upper lip is raised, and you see all his teeth, and you even see his gums. And it was a very competitive, dominant expression, this snarling of Alcaraz. He only did it maybe 4 or 5 times that I saw, but it was a very intense emotional expression of competitiveness. And he would usually be pumping his fist at the same time and looking up at his team in the crowd with this snarl, which is quite an unusual expression for a human. And so, yeah, look forward to discussing those two personal experiences of mine in relation to zoology and the animal kingdom in general.
Yes, well, those two observations are fascinating to consider together because what Taylor Swift is doing with her eyes epitomizes a particular human specialization, which is a kind of eye language involving the conspicuous whites of the eyes and our neurological settings that make those eye movements extremely obvious to us. We can read them with great skill because of the way our brains are configured. But it's also because of the way our eyes are constructed and colored. And we can get onto that in more detail. So Taylor Swift is doing what humans do to perfection and on an enormous scale because of the electronic screen to a huge crowd. And that's, unprecedented in human history. But the scale on which she's doing it is unprecedented. But what she's doing with her eyes is thoroughly human. Whereas the tennis player, in my view, is doing something not human in the sense that we have no intrinsic instinctive snarling repertoire. And that's because unlike other snarling, or I prefer to call it fang-bearing animals, we do not have canine teeth that are worth showing off. Now, you can understand a smile in a human because it displays good bone structure in the form of the teeth. So that's a functional facial expression in the sense that it serves some kind of adaptive purpose. But when it comes to snarling, I suspect that only some cultures of humans snarl. It would be interesting to do a survey of that around the different cultures, different ethnic groups around the world to see. And again, I'd rather call it fang-bearing because to my mind, snarling is an auditory phenomenon, whereas fang-bearing is a visual phenomenon. So this tennis player is fang-bearing, but the problem is he doesn't have fangs. And so unlike Taylor Swift, he's not displaying something that humans do. And what I think he's doing is subconsciously emulating dogs, because dogs, including the canids, including the domestic dog, are the fang-bearing equivalent, as it were, of what Taylor Swift is doing. The genus Canis epitomizes the display of the upper canines in a very elaborate and graphic facial expression. And right. I think it's our cultural relationship in Western societies with the dog that subconsciously causes us to emulate the dog, not as the dog perhaps, but as the wolf, as the kind of idea of a defiant, fierce canid, because we have this kind of romantic relationship with the wolf. So I know I'm mind reading a lot here, but I'm raising certain questions. I'm saying that it would be interesting to do a survey of the different cultures to see which cultures, which races, and so on, fang bear in the way the tennis player is doing, and which don't. And if it's selective, then I suspect it'll be found in cultures such as ours, where we respect and admire or have empathy with dogs. You see, this is not to be taken for granted, because in some cultures, dogs are regarded as filthy and despicable animals, and they live in villages only as street dogs. They live as nuggety little survivors, despite human attitudes to them, rather than because of any human fostering. And also because in many cultures in the past, and some in the present, dogs were simply farmed as livestock, as edible livestock, without any affection or any empathy being directed towards them. So this is a far-out hypothesis that those cultures in which we fang bear as humans, mainly males, are also the cultures in which we subconsciously emulate the expressions of our dogs. But returning from that rather far-fetched hypothesis to the main question, what we can explore here is the different eye languages of, firstly, humans and our hominid co-familials, the great apes, and then let's pick on the canids and the felids as examples of animals that have minimal eye language, and then we can look at the fang-bearing expression. And having put to bed the idea that we humans have any particular fang-bearing expression, let's look at what that fang-bearing expression constitutes in both canids and felids, and how the adaptive coloration around the face accentuates it in a very graphic manner.
No, I look forward to that. So eyes first, then fangs. But perhaps before we start that, just a question from my side. Have you seen such snarling fang-bearing in humans over your life? When it comes to eye whites and the use of eyes, we do that all the time in social interactions as humans. But snarling just isn't that common. Would you agree?
I haven't paid particular attention to it, but I guess it's mainly masculine.
Yeah.
And I guess it's also often manifest in either genuine aggression or pretend aggression, as in sports. So I think it's quite common among men in our culture.
Okay.
And it's taken as an aggressive expression, or to some degree a sort of a hierarchically dominant expression. But I'll have to just keep an eye out for it. I've got a search image for it now. Okay. I don't think it's rare, but I think it's scientifically more interesting than it would seem.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So eye whites and how we use them versus other animals.
Yes, well, we humans take it for granted that, number one, the sclera of the eye is white, as opposed to the darker tones of our iris, our pupil, our eyelashes, and our eyebrows, and in some races, our skins. So we take that whiteness for granted, but it's not to be taken for granted, because all of the other members of our family, the hominidae, lack the eye whites that we have, with only partial exceptions. So, for example, in the two species of chimpanzee, what we call the eye white is largely tanned to the point of being brown, and the same is true in the gorillas. And then in the three species of orangutans, it's also largely inconspicuous, but I've noticed that in adult but not fully mature males, it briefly depigmentizes and goes back to white for a certain number of years before the eyes become obscure and inscrutable again. So it's a complex business, and among monkeys as well, most monkeys have blacked out eye whites, in the sense that they're tanned to the point of being inconspicuous. But some monkeys, particularly some of the macaques in Southeast Asia and some of the South American monkeys, such as the capuchins, they do also have eye whites. And so it'd be a fascinating thing to survey all of the monkeys in the world and to study their eye whites with the human model in mind. I think that some species of monkeys expose their eye whites as much as we do as humans, but I doubt whether any of them has the same kind of neurological setting that gives us this complex eye language, because we humans are very subtle in our eye language. The eyes reveal a great deal about attention, intention, and emotion. And so we're constantly subconsciously monitoring each other's eye movements, because that little, those two little white triangles, one to the left of each iris and one to the right of each iris, speak volumes about what's going on in the mind of the behind the face, as it were. So the point I'd like to make here is that the most obvious and important thing to start with is that the great apes do not share our eye white displays with us.
Yeah.
Which implies that they have adapted to be inscrutable in ocular terms, whereas we have adapted to be scrutable. We are scrutable to each other. They are inscrutable to each other. They don't communicate with their eyes in the fine-tuned way that we do.
Does that mean their communication in general is likely to be just far less sophisticated than ours, or do you think they have some alternative way of conveying subtle messages?
That's a fascinating question, really and truly. It's possible that the great apes, even the chimps, which are regarded, well, the chimps and orangutans are regarded as more encephalized than the gorillas, bigger brains relative to body size, but it's possible that all of these great apes are crude in terms of their body language. Compared to, for example, horses, the domestic horse, although very difficult to compare with us because they're such a differently constructed animal, has proven to be astonishingly sensitive to movement and to gesture and to posture in a way that it's almost difficult for us to understand, because there's this case of this famous horse called Clever Hans, who could seem to read the minds of the people who took care of him. And the horse seems to be so visually acute, particularly to motion, that it can detect the tiniest motion in a human and respond accordingly. So there's a possibility that in terms of, not so much in terms of eye language, but in terms of the visual acuity of the animal in observing the body language of the object, horses are more acute than great apes. But then again, I haven't studied great apes' body language very much, and it could be that they have subtle gestures and facial expressions. They certainly do have some facial expressions, but what I can say is that when it comes to the facial expressions of the eye, the other 7 members of the hominidae are so different from us that they may as well be in a different family. Humans are vastly the exception in the hominidae. Presumably we also had blacked out irises when we were Australopithecines, because most monkeys do, and the great ape ancestors probably did as well. So we humans have taken a melanized, tanned, blacked out, browned out sclera, and we've depigmentized it as we became modern humans in order to do this exquisitely human thing of subtle, complex, continual, and subconscious eye language. But if anybody thinks that came from our great ape ancestors or our monkey ancestors, that's probably not the case. That we have independently re-evolved eye whites. That seems obvious. Yeah.
And orangutans do have eye white at a certain part of their lifespan, the males at least. Do you think they're then using those eye whites in a similar manner to us at some level?
Yes, I think they're communicating subtly in a sociosexual way. In humans we call it making eyes, or the eyes have it, or so on. And possibly the best explanation for why it's only the adult but not fully mature males that show any significant flickering of the eye whites in orangutans is that they have a particularly challenging time, given that they're sort of in waiting for the demise of the top male in their population. So, as readers probably know, orangutans mature into the sort of grotesque, face-folded mature males, not so much according to time, but according to opportunity, based on hormonal cues. So a male can sometimes be kept many years in limbo. He's perfectly sexually mature, but he doesn't develop the full set of secondary sexual characteristics associated with masculinity until he gets a chance to be the dominant male in his population. And then all those anatomical things arrive, you see. So you can have quite a lot of adult, sexually willing but frustrated males in a population who haven't manifested their full masculine repertoire of facial folds and massive muscles and so on, because they've been hormonally suppressed by being subordinate. And in that situation, it's possible that they become what zoologists officially call sneaky fuckers, and this is something that you pointed out to me, because they try to get matings anyway, and maybe they do it not by the kind of macho signals put out by the official hierarchy top males, but rather by a kind of sneaky wooing of the females involving making eyes at them. Again, we're reading a lot into a little bit of evidence, but orangutan society is probably complex enough that you can fit in this phenomenon of a sort of a quasi-emulation of humans in one age and sex class, which is the adult but not fully mature males. And then, you see, the beauty of this kind of speculation is that it raises a search image which might otherwise be missed. Because you could study orangutans for years in great detail and never pick up on these kinds of phenomena unless you have a particular search image for them.
Yeah. Just coming back to Taylor Swift then, she's in essence making eyes with the audience. So every individual in the audience is feeling this connection with her because of her, subtle eye movements potentially on this enormous screen. A family member of mine pointed out, without me having suggested it to him, that he was just astounded how the crowd responded to a subtle shift in her eye positioning. So are you surprised by that apparent power she has of just moving her pupils and the whole audience responding? It's quite a thing to contemplate.
Well, I'm surprised to hear about it, but I'm not surprised that it exists. I would put the surprise on its head, and I would say that considering the potential for magnification and projection of the human face on electronic screens on a large scale, it's a wonder to me that it took Taylor Swift to cotton on to this method of bewitching an audience, because this could probably have been done decades ago if somebody realized the opportunity. Because what she's doing as a human phenomenon is perfectly rote. It's absolutely normal. It's absolutely ubiquitous. Every woman does it and always will. Every woman and every man, indeed, but particularly women in this context, are past masters at an instinctual and intuitive level in the business of eye language, or, as you put it, making eyes. So the fact that she's doing it is skillful, perhaps, but the real key to understanding it is that she's been smart enough to project it on the scale and in the intensity that she has. And she's opened up a key or a portal to a kind of adulation that is crucially dependent on electronic enhancement, if you see what I'm saying. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is this use of the eyes is taking place in every bar across the planet.
Yes, except that you have to be sitting across from a woman to perceive it, It works at a moderate distance. There's this trope about our eyes met across a crowded room. I mean, you can probably make eyes with somebody at a distance of, 10, 20 meters. If you've got good eyes, good eyesight. But Taylor Swift is doing something 2 orders of magnitude above that. And so I would be a little maverickish here, and I would say that while I give full credit to Taylor Swift for her immense skill as an entertainer, and I also think that her many Swiftie fans are onto something in the sense that she really is a class act. Nonetheless, I think that her main trick in the context of what we're talking about now has been to leverage, as it were, the electronic, shall we say, magnification of what is intrinsically a very normal human eye language.
Right. And there's also something perhaps unusual about it in that it's so public and just on display, and 70,000 or even 90,000 people in some of the stadiums she's performing in, 90,000 people responding in a very public setting, whereas the eye glances have evolved to be furtive, secretive, private things. Often the glance is used to communicate in a secretive way. And here it's just this incredible public use of that power.
Yes, well, that's a very stimulating point you make there, that framing, Anthony, because it strikes me that we already understand the concept of pornography. I don't need to describe it because everybody's familiar with it. But here we have something that possibly deserves a new term, as epitomized by Taylor Swift. And you could call it either oculography or perhaps sclerography. Oculography because oculo means, referring to the eyes in general. And sclerography because what Taylor Swift is really using with her eye language is the shifting, small but very obvious triangles of eye white.
Right.
There's 4 of these triangles, one to the left and one to the right of each iris. And so she's communicating in oculography. And I'm not suggesting that oculography is an obscene or morally indictable thing, even if you think that pornography is, but it's kind of in the same category because it's entrancing, bewitching, and highly effective on the emotional systems of the viewers, even though to some degree it's an illusion because they're not actually having an intimate interaction with Taylor Swift. It just feels like that. So there's a real link between pornography and what she's doing with her eyes. And that's not a criticism. It's if anything, it's a praise of her.
Yeah,
it's very smart and very effective.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating phenomenon. This. So perhaps before we leave eye whites and move on to the fang bearing, it's true to say that humans are the master of eye communication across the animal kingdom, and that most species, mammals, don't use the white sclera. I'm thinking of wolves, for example, and the domestic dog. There's something strange there in that wolves don't use the white sclera, but our best friend, the domestic dog, does to some extent. How do we explain that?
Yes, well, I think that's one of the most interesting differences between the domestic dog and the wolf. And I suspect that subconsciously we humans have bred into the domestic dog along the process of domestication, an eye white display somewhat emulating our own. I'm not suggesting it was intentional, but we're so intensely wedded to eye white displays that we've selected inadvertently those individuals of the dog line that have somewhat looser eyelids than their ancestors, and therefore display the eye whites more. So you can see this in most breeds to some degree, but particularly in the sort of shall we say rather massive faced breeds like boxers or mastiffs and so on. You'll see that when a domestic dog looks sideways, the eye white does flash, and so you feel more empathy towards your dog because the dog, he or she, emulates your own facial eye white display to some degree. The direction of gaze is revealed, and it enhances facial expression and makes the whole face of the dog much more human-like. And as far as I know, the domestic dog is the only domestic animal that we have bred to have an eye white display in partial emulation of our own. That certainly hasn't happened in the domestic cat, or in the horse, or in the donkey. So it is an interesting thing. And I invite readers to have a good hard look at comparative photos of the wolf and the domestic dog, and look at the eyes, and you'll find that there's an almost categorical difference in the effect of the eyes in the two species. Even if the wolf is the ancestor of the domestic dog, which I personally doubt, but it doesn't matter. The comparison is still valid, because wolves don't communicate in any subtle way with their eyes. What they do is they either avert their eyes or they stare. And when they stare, it's a powerful emotional signal, but it's not done with any subtlety. And all it is a perception that the animal is looking directly at you. And if there's any coloration display involved, what it is that the relatively pale iris of the wolf is in some contrast to the dark, tight eyelids. So when a wolf stares at you, you see a somewhat of a dark pale display, but it's nothing like an eye white display, because what it is a relatively pale iris set in a kind of almond-shaped black tight eyelid setting, one on the left, one on the right. And that combination makes the stare of a wolf baleful. Not scrutable, but baleful. So it's obvious the animal's looking at you, and there's some accentuation by pale and dark, but there's no subtlety to it. It's like pure threat. Whereas
it's
in the domestic
menacing.
It's menacing, it's baleful, yes. Whereas the domestic dog has become somewhat scrutable. Now, on a scale of scrutability, where humans are at 10, and, for example, gorillas are maybe a 2 because of their blacked out scleras, and adult but not fully mature male orangutans are maybe a 5. Some domestic dogs are up there probably a 6 or a 7 in the ones that have relatively loose eyelids. Yeah. But the wolf will be down maybe at the same level as the apes. So wolves, like apes, do not have scrutable eye whites, scleras. I shouldn't call them eye whites because they're not white in those animals. They don't have a scrutable sclera. Yeah. Whereas we humans have a scrutable sclera, and our domestic dogs somewhat emulate us.
And the other species of Canis, are they also inscrutable sclera?
As I understand it, yes. I've looked at pictures of the coyote, the various jackals, and so on. And I think all of the species of Canis have essentially inscrutable eyes. Yes, they don't communicate by means of their eye whites. You can only see the eye white in these wild Canis animals species when there's a sharp sideways glance. So you'll see a tiny bit of. But it probably doesn't have any particular communicative value.
Yeah. When a domestic dog is staring at you, assuming that wolves and other canids, when they stare at it, it's a threat. It's a threatening thing staring. Have we domesticated the dog to a point where a stare is at us is now a positive emotion as opposed to a negative one?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I wouldn't hazard an answer. I would say let us go away and think about that.
Yeah.
But what I can say is that it's not just the exposure of the eye whites in the domestic dog that's interesting. It's also the eyebrows, because the eyebrows of the domestic dog are probably more expressive than those of wild Canis. We've inadvertently made the eyebrow, which is more like a circular feature rather than a linear feature as in humans. It's a kind of a circular eyebrow, and it's lifted, and it's quite expressive in a dog. Yeah. And I suspect that if somebody were to compare that closely with wild counterparts in the same genus, you'd find that the dog has improved in its eyebrow expressiveness, which is enhanced in the black and tan varieties of dog by having a pale spot right on the eyebrow, which makes the movement of the eyebrow conspicuous in a way that is not true for a wolf. A wolf does not have that mark, that pale mark on its eyebrow.
Right.
So there's at least two aspects of the ocular coloration and anatomy that seems to have been enhanced in the domestic dog in order to communicate better with humans.
Yeah, and I think coming back to Taylor Swift, she uses her eye whites and her eyebrows very effectively. Yeah, they in sync, so that deep primal instinct of hers to use her facial expressions effectively. It's not just an eye whites thing; it's an eye white plus eyebrow.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point because dark-skinned people tend to have eyebrows that are lost in the overall darkness of the face, whereas pale-skinned people often have eyebrows that are dark enough to notice against the pale skin. So contrast that with the fact that all humans have white eyes, white scleras.
Yeah.
So although the eyebrows are important, they seem to be not as important, not as basic to being human as the eye whites are.
Right. Okay.
I don't think it would have surprised anybody from a biological point of view if the various dark-skinned races had dark scleras. But that's not the case. That's not the case. Every human being has got basically fully white scleras, as far as I know.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
Fascinating. Thanks. So moving on to Carlos Alcaraz and his fang bearing, I think you wanted to discuss that in the context of wolves and hominids as well, and felids.
Yes, well, Alcaraz's fang-bearing emulation is nothing but a shadow of what happens in, for example, canids and felids, because they really do a fang-bearing expression that is not only extremely enhanced anatomically, but is also, depending on the species, made more graphic by the actual coloration, which is often quite complex coloration on and near the mouth. And it's interesting to have that as a search image when you look at pictures of fang bearing in the wolf and in other members of the genus Canis, and then in the various felidae, ranging from, for example, the leopard, in which this whole display is largely anatomical because there's very little coloration enhancing it, through to something like the caracal, the African equivalent of a lynx, caracal, in which not only is there a drastic anatomical manifestation of the fang-bearing expression, but the coloration of the face is in a complicated and graphic way designed to enhance and accentuate that expression.
Right. Even the lion has the interesting mix of using fangs and color to warn a would-be aggressor.
Well, that's right. And that's best seen in the female because her visage is less complicated. It doesn't have a mane. But if you look at a female individual of the lion fang-bearing, which it does quite readily, the main thing being displayed is the upper canines, which are, fairly conspicuous because they're pale.
Yeah.
But it's not just a case of peeling back the upper lip to expose the upper canines, because there are other aspects of coloration which deserve to be explained, such as the black bare surfaces of the lower lip all the way back to the gape, the corner of the mouth. And that blackness, which I believe to be common to all species in the felidae, that should be checked. But I think that blackness on the lower lips is a widespread pattern. That provides a dark pale contrast that offsets the upper canines. And so in a lion, that's the main effect. There are other subtle aspects to it. For example, if you look at the gums, the gingival surfaces, both upper and lower, next to the incisor rows, bearing in mind that the incisor teeth of cats are small. The incisor row is located between the left canine and the right canine. You'll see that the gums are dark pigmented.
Yeah.
which cannot be accounted for by exposure to ultraviolet, because the gums are not exposed often enough to the sun for that protective mechanism to have evolved. So even the gums are somewhat dark enhanced in order to provide a contrast to the white teeth. And then, of course, the chin, the pelage, the hairs on the chin of a lion are perhaps the whitest, the palest part of the whole animal. They're invariably, in male and female, they're invariably whitish. And so when a lion fang bears, there's more to it than just moving the face in order to expose the teeth. It's also presenting a kind of a graphic image involving coloration of hairy surfaces and bare surfaces, and surfaces outside the mouth and surfaces within the mouth, such as the gums. It's a complex matter. But in the lion, you could be forgiven for not noticing it. But when you look at a photo of a fang-bearing caracal, then you can't miss it, because that face it's like a face endowed with war paint. It's a perfectly beautiful, spectacular, defiant visage, where the teeth actually become the least interesting part, because whereas the upper canines of a lion are big enough to be impressive, when a caracal fang bears at you, the upper teeth are rather puny and are actually a minor part of the display. What that animal is doing is it's fang bearing technically, but it's more presenting a defiant face, in which it's mainly the complex pattern of coloration involving dark and pale contrasts that produces the emotional effect, and signifies not just the danger of the canine teeth, but also the danger of the 20 sharp claws.
Yeah, it's a warring display of sorts, and I think you have some new terminology to categorize these different types of flags or displays.
Yes, well, it's long been the case that we haven't had a word for these kinds of coloration patterns. Let me just mention the coloration pattern on the wolf before we go on to the terminology. If you look at the wolf when it fang bears, it does so differently from a cat, from a felid. Because firstly, it doesn't necessarily open its mouth very wide. Sometimes it fang bears with the mouth essentially closed. And secondly, there's a greater dark pale contrast, because in the wolf, there's a more extensive blackish tone to the lips as well as the rhinarium. So when a wolf fang bears, its teeth, upper and lower canines, are graphically offset by a black mouth, and that's true even when the mouth is not particularly open. And in the wolf, even more than in felids, the nose, the rhinarium, is pulled drastically up, wrinkling it up against the rostrum. And this is not true for other canids. For example, if you look at the black-backed jackal, which is like a canis equivalent in savannas of Africa, it hardly has a fang-bearing expression at all. And the African hunting dog, which we think of as an extremely ferocious and capable predator, it has very little facial expression. Its eyes are blacked out against the dark fur of the face. It doesn't fang bear, as far as I know. It has an impassive face. So one shouldn't take the kind of expressions that canis, including the wolf, manifest as being indicative of the family as a whole. There's a great contrast between an African hunting dog and a wolf in facial expressions, both in terms of fang bearing and in terms of the eyes. And the African hunting dog is remarkably impassive with respect to its face. It expresses itself much more with its tail, which has this very conspicuous white distal half and is raised to erection in excitement. So the African hunting dog communicates with its tail, whereas the wolf communicates with its face.
Yeah, if you look at photographs of Carlos Alcaraz, he's also got when he snarls or fang bears, he's also got the wrinkling of the nose, happening.
Yes, well, it's you see, this emulation exemplified by Alcaraz could derive from two different origins. Firstly, it could be some primal, atavistic, ancestral, instinctive commonality between us and other mammals.
Yeah.
But I find that unlikely, because although there are fang-bearing expressions in, for example, baboons, mandrills, mangabes, and so on, and macaques, the fang-bearing is rather different in those animals, because those animals don't fang-bear so much in confrontation with aggressors and antagonists. They fang-bear more as a passive status display, pretending to be a yawn. So the fang-bearing expression of a baboon, although highly impressive, is in a different kind of category from those that we see in carnivora. And I find it difficult to understand how through the primate line, which is a very primitive line, I mean, the primates branched off from the main mammalian line very early, way back in the Eocene. So we have very little in common in terms of ancestry with carnivora. So when Alcaraz seems to emulate a sort of carnivoran fang-bearing expression, my suspicion would be that it's the second possible pathway of origin, which is more by behavioral emulation. And I'm not suggesting there's anything conscious about it. I think it's completely subconscious. But I think that he's basically saying, I'm like a wolf, or like a tiger, or like a lion. You know, he's invoking that similarity behaviorally, not through intrinsic human anatomical and neurological settings, but rather through behavioral emulation.
It's unlikely that there's an instinctive urge to show one's teeth as weapons because we humans bit each other in a heat of a battle between two males. That's implausible.
Well, I think the males and females have bitten each other a lot. I think one shouldn't assume that biting is not an important part of human fighting. I think it is an important part.
Yeah.
Yes, I do think so. But it's a different thing to suggest that it would be the teeth would be displayed in that context, because you see, the important thing to understand is that fang bearing actually displays some impressive armaments. In the case of baboons, very impressive armaments. In the case of cats and dogs, also, you know, the canine teeth of carnivora are basically what carnivora, in some sense, are all about. So, very understandable that they display those primary weapons. But human beings simply do not have impressive canines, including mature males. We just many primates that have sexual dimorphism have a pattern in which the canines are only impressive in males. For example, in all the baboons, all the macaques, all the mandrills and galada and so on, it's only the males that have impressive upper canines. The females have nothing to speak of. So in the primates, impressive canines are a masculine thing. But in humans, that's been completely lost, because although the human male face and head size are quite different from those of a woman, there's essentially no difference in the configuration of the canines. We just don't have much to display. So it's better to raise your fist than it is to wrinkle up your upper lip. And so if we're doing that, it hints to me that it's, if you like, a matter of software programming rather than hardware programming, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you were going to mention the terms that you think might apply for understanding this, categorizing these different colorations and expressions.
Right. Okay. So there's a general, very well accepted and very commonly observed pattern of coloration in the natural world. It's not even restricted to animals. It occurs also in plants, called aposematism. And aposematism is essentially warning coloration. And it covers a wide variety of phenomena. But the important thing about aposematism is twofold. Number one, it refers to the whole body. So in the carnivora, the perfect example is certain species of skunks in the family Mephitidae. The entire body is conspicuously dark and pale, black and white. You can't miss it. And so the idea is not only to warn off potential attackers by being so conspicuous that the first thought of any attacker is, what do you know that I don't know? Because most animals don't want to be noticed. And you, Mr. Skunk, are a kind of a living flag. So this is deep cause for suspicion, because the predator realizes the skunk would not be displaying itself in that way if it was not confident of its defenses. And secondly, the fact that the coloration is so extremely conspicuous can be explained by the fact that a skunk does not have an obvious armament. See, the skunk is not fang bearing. The skunk is not saying, here are my armaments and this is what I'm going to do to you with them. It's saying, I have something you don't get, Mr. Predator. And I'd advise you not to get to the position where you get it. It's that F around and find out meme. The skunk is saying, don't F around and find out, because take my word for it, I wouldn't look this way unless I had some hidden weapon that you don't want to get to know better than you already do. So there's two aspects there: whole figure coloration of a conspicuous kind, and hidden weapon or a non-apparent weapon. That's the basic concept of aposematism. It also applies, for example, to stink bugs. There's many examples. We could cite literally hundreds of examples in all sorts of clades in the animal kingdom, but a stink bug is another perfect example, because some species of stink bugs are garishly colored and they have a non-apparent weapon. You only find out when you actually bite the animal, and then you're going to spit it out very quickly, and you might get poisoned in the process. So everybody understands aposematism, despite the fact that it's so widespread among hundreds of clades of all kinds of organisms, that the challenge there is the bewildering task of if you like, cataloging all these different varieties, manifestations, nuances, and forms of aposematism. But then you come to something like the facial pattern on a caracal, this felid, as African lynx-like felid that we call caracal, and it needs a name because it's a very conspicuous pattern of coloration, but it doesn't conform to aposematism for at least two reasons. Number one is it's restricted to the face, and when the animal is simply moving around and not expressing itself with the fang-bearing expression, you could actually overlook that facial pattern. It's just not that conspicuous at all. And secondly, when the animal does fang bear, you can see the fangs. And you have to be pretty dumb as a predator not to realize that same caracal has got 20 lethally sharp claws that can take your eye out. So it's not as if a caracal is in the same category as a skunk. Yeah. It's not like it has to go to great pains to demonstrate that it has a weapon. So what is the nature of that coloration? And nobody has given these kinds of patterns a name. And so I came up with the name an aposignum. Okay. The signum, signum, comes from the Latin word for sign. And apo comes from the same word root as in aposematic. In other words, apo means get away from me, basically. It repels rather than attracting. So I suggest we call that kind of pattern an aposignum. And it's found also in the puma, Puma concolor, which is a larger cat, also with a graphically black and white muzzle region on the face.
Fantastic. I like the new term. And do you think it's most evident in the caracal, because the caracal is exposed to perhaps some of the most extreme predation of any equivalent sized cat globally?
Well, that's an idea. It needs to be tested. But if anybody wants to test that, I would say the first thing you should do is compare the caracal with another lynx. And I refer to the Canada lynx canadensis. So both the caracal of Africa and Southern Asia, India, places like that, and the Canada lynx, which is found in the American section of the boreal zone, the taiga zone, they're both lynxes. They're both around about 10 kilograms. They're very comparable animals. But what's different about them is that the Canada lynx hardly has a fang-bearing expression at all. It's very reluctant to fang bear. And when it does, there's nothing particular about the coloration of the face that enhances or accentuates that expression. And so in a single kind of category of carnivores, which is the lynx-like 10-kilogram felids, you've got a great contrast. And then the question arises, according to your suggestion, is it possible that the predatory environments in Africa versus the boreal zone in North America are so different that you can explain this this fact that the caracal epitomizes an aposignum on the face, whereas the Canada lynx lacks anything like that at all. It's plausible because, wherever the caracal lives, it's surrounded by numerous carnivores that would just love to kill it, including its own co-familial, the leopard.
Mm.
So it's possible that through evolution, the caracal has come to be very emphatic in its self-defensive display, whereas the Canada lynx lives in a much more rarefied atmosphere. Sure, there is the wolf and there is the grizzly bear and so on, but it doesn't live in the same sort of hectic intensity of predator threat. Does that make sense?
It does, but then the question comes to mind why the puma does have similar coloration. Do you think the wolf and the grizzly bear target the puma more than the lynx?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I don't know. It's hard to say intuitively. But I think that the puma is a widespread animal in both of the Americas, and it's in the same size category as the wolf and perhaps some of the bears. So the difference is that the Canada lynx is more furtive. It's furtive both in the sense of being in a rather remote biome that doesn't have very dense populations of any predator, namely the coniferous forests of Canada and so on. And it's also furtive in the sense that it's smallish and perhaps harder to encounter than the puma. But the puma is a bit of a mystery because the puma is the American equivalent of a leopard in some sense. But it's very different from the leopard because the leopard doesn't really have much of a facial coloration pattern to speak of. Its face is thoroughly camouflage colored, whereas the puma, the American leopard, as it were, does not have the same nondescript spotted camouflage colored face. I realize that phylogenetically the jaguar is closer to the leopard, but the jaguar is rather different from the leopard in being a much more brawny and much more water adapted form of panthera. Yeah. So I'm not pretending to explain this, but the puma would be a good animal to study because, you see, in the Rocky Mountains of North America, the puma does have the wolf and the grizzly to contend with, and so it might have evolved this facial pattern of coloration. But in the southern Andes in Chile, it doesn't really have any other large carnivore to contend with. It is the top carnivore, and so you would predict that it would have lost any aposignum that it has in North America. And the photos show that the facial pattern in the Andes is somewhat subdued in the puma, but it's not exactly removed. And so, nature has a frustrating habit of shades of gray rather than categorical distinctions. And so, you have to be a little arbitrary in your interpretation of these kinds of variations. Yeah,
and can we see any of this playing out in our suburban gardens and streets with cats facing dogs? One can picture the domestic cat snarling, fang-bearing. Is there any aposignum with any of the domestic cat breeds that you're aware of? Is there any of this sort of communication happening between dogs and cats?
There's a tenuous remnant of an extremely interesting aposignum in the tabby breeds of the domestic cat. Now, mostly when a cat confronts a dog, which is a fascinating thing to watch because you're usually looking at a several-fold difference in body mass.
Yeah.
A domestic cat can easily be only 3 kilograms, whereas many breeds of dog are more than 20. You could say there's an order of magnitude difference in body mass in general. Nonetheless, the cat usually holds its own, as long as it doesn't flee, because the dog knows intuitively that those 10 sharp claws are potentially life-threatening. That's what the cat has. The cat doesn't have teeth that are ever going to defend it against the dog. But those claws that a cat possesses and a dog doesn't are the deal breakers. They are the nuclear deterrent. Yeah. And it's interesting that the domestic cat and most other species of the felidae do not directly display their weaponry in the form of their claws. Instead, what they do is they try to make themselves look as big as possible by stretching up on their legs and then arching their back and raising their fur. And that in exaggeration of their body size is psychologically effective. But what's interesting is that the one of the subspecies of the main wild ancestor of the domestic cat, and I'm talking about the species Felis libica, several subspecies, particularly the one in the Kalahari of southern Africa, has a very interesting and readily observed aposignum on the inside surface, the inner or medial surface of the foreleg. And what happens is when that animal adopts that defensive stance of standing high on its legs, arching its back, raising its fur, and fang bearing, it puts forward one of its 4 feet, one of its 4 legs, to display a certain aposignum on the inner side, normally hidden by the shadows of the foreleg, and that consists of a conspicuous, dark and pale barring, a bit like the metaphorical equivalent of a no-go zone, a black bar. It's very archetypal. It's universally understood. When you have a dark bar, it means stop or no go or get away. And if readers look up photos on Google Images of the African wildcat Felis libica, particularly those that come from the Kalahari, you'll quickly see that this particular dark and pale bar on the inside surface of the foreleg is by far the most graphic feature of coloration on the whole animal. Now, normally when the animal moseys along or is lying around, you don't see it because it's on a surface that's configured to be hidden normally. But when the animal is in defensive posture, that dark and pale aposignum on the inner surface of the foreleg is, to my mind, more conspicuous and more sinister than the fang-bearing expression. And seems to, again, have evolved in a particular part of Africa because of the intense predatory predicament that animal has encountered in its evolutionary history.
Sorry, what does the tabby cat have as an aposignum?
The tabby cat retains the dark and pale pigmentation on the pelage, but it's not as obvious as in the Kalahari African wildcat. You can see a trace of it there, but these colorations are subtle in the sense that they can be conspicuous or not conspicuous depending on what's around them.
Okay.
So if you look at the inner foreleg of a tabby, you'll see that barring. But in the context of the whole foreleg, it just doesn't strike you. You can have an individual domestic tabby its whole life, and you will never notice that pattern.
Okay.
Whereas when the African wildcat adopts a defensive stance, it just strikes you right out. It's obvious.
Okay. And domestic cats don't have any black and white aposignum with regards to the fang bearing.
I haven't checked. Have a look on the web, readers, and see if the lower lip, all the way back to the gape, the bare part of the lower lip, all the way back to the gape in the domestic cat is black.
Yeah. Okay.
I predict that it is, but I'm ashamed to say I've never actually bothered to look. But apart from that, there's nothing much about the face. It's not like the caracal, which has an elaborate pattern consisting of about 10 different features.
Yeah.
All the way from the rostrum through the rhinarium and the philtrum and the upper lip and the junction between the upper lip and the cheeks, and then the lower lips and the gape and the chin, and all of these features are involved in that aposignum in the caracal, and there's nothing really like that in the genus Felis, as far as I know.
The South American cats also have elaborate aposigna.
Some do. The pampas cat has something going on, but again, you'd have to survey all the different genera and species and kind of deal with the details to sort it all out. It's a complex pattern, worthy of complex study. But in the Felidae, the two species that jump out, and they belong to different genera, that really jump out as having aposigna are the puma and the caracal.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Anthony. That's been quite a tour through humans and felids and canids. Most enjoyable. Thanks so much, and look forward to further discussions on this.
Thanks. I've enjoyed it too. And to readers, have a little poke around with Google Images and bring up some photos of these phenomena and see what you can sort out. And please like, subscribe, and share if you really like this show. And we look forward to seeing you next time here at the BioEdge. And until then, over and out from us.
Cheers.